I'm your host, Michael, and I am a meditation teacher, a musician, a mentor, and a conversationalist from Melbourne, Australia. And together we're going to explore this space with one another, and hopefully by the end of this conversation you'll have a deeper sense of what participation and contribution in the emergent world story looks like for you. Maybe you'll have some inspiration, some motivation, some clarity around the matter. And it's my hope that these episodes really do help you cultivate ongoingly your own practices of presence. Today's guest is Donald Rothberg. Let me read through Donald's bio before we begin. Dr. Donald Rothberg is one of the nation's foremost leaders in socially engaged spirituality. His experience uniquely combines a long record of activism and organizing extensive teaching and leadership roles in pioneering programs that weave together social action with spirituality. He has practiced Buddhist meditation for over 25 years and has been significantly influenced by other spiritual traditions, particularly Jewish, Christian, and Indigenous. Recently, Donald directed the 2-year training program in connecting the individual and social transformation, the path of engagement, through Spirit Rock Meditation Center and the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. He's on the Teachers Council of Spirit Rock and has been an organizer, teacher, and board member of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. Donald has also served as a director of Socially Engaged Spirituality Program at the Saybrook Graduate School in San Francisco. And he's got a wonderful book as well. It's called The Engaged Spiritual Life, a Buddhist Approach to Transforming Ourselves and the World. And you can see, I'm sure, why I felt like Donald would be a perfect fit for the show. And I'm really looking forward to share this one with you. So before we begin, let's take a deep breath in and out together. So feel free to just get comfortable for a moment. Let's find a little bit of pause within our day to just take 1 or 2 conscious breaths in through the nose. You might like to close your eyes and slow things right down. And whenever it is that you may reach the peak of the breath, feel free to just be there for a moment, be there in that moment before just as gracefully and gently releasing. Feel free to repeat this process once, twice, or as many times as you feel as we gently open into this conversational space with Donald. Yeah. So I was just going to say that it seems as though you've worked with a lot of different teachers and you've kind of weaved in and out a lot of different interesting methods and practices over your time. And there's been a lot of kind of engaged action as well in your life. And it just, there's quite like this feeling like there's quite a lot in terms of just what I've run through the links that you sent. It seems like that's the case in terms of the richness of your experience and your wisdom. So for me, I find that quite inspirational, and I'd love to kind of, I don't know, maybe work through some of the things that I'm going through at the moment in terms of finding or finding my footing on my path, and then hopefully that could help people, just because people may be having similar experiences. I also kind of was thinking, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, maybe because there is so much. I mean, I've written down quite a few gems that I've found, and I was wondering if we could just go in kind of a sporadic direction rather than the natural kind of, I mean, it will be natural, I'm sure, but usually there'll be some kind of a solid theme, and we'll go through that. And I was thinking if we just spread the gems out, maybe people might see or find 1 or 2 that connect with them and they can go deeper on their own.
Sure, I'll take your lead. You know your audience.
Okay, wonderful. Well, the first thing was that that came up for me was this idea of equanimity and and having a long-term perspective on things.
Oh yeah.
And I really kind of appreciated that. And it seems to be where some of the recent conversations have led. I think you mentioned in one of your talks from the Big Bang, looking many generations forward. So this sense of like zooming out, and that quality of equanimity I found might be a nice place to start. And that theme might be a nice place to open into, I thought, or felt.
Yeah, I think there are many dimensions of equanimity. I mean, it's certainly in the teachings of the Buddha, equanimity is actually somewhat close to nibbana. So it's in the presence of the sacred when one is experiencing equanimity. It's again, it's an unusual English word, but it really has to do, in my own experience, has to do with on an individual level. Most basically, it's about the ability to be balanced with what comes up, and to be balanced and non-reactive with what comes up. And so then we could ask, how can I be balanced and non-reactive with this range of experiences, or these particularly challenging experiences? And in my experience, a lot of the learning about equanimity comes from having been non-balanced, reactive, and non-equanimous, and having learned from it. So I think one of the great contributors to developing equanimity is having an approach to life in which we see life as about learning. And of course, from the spiritual traditions, it's about learning to awaken or to come into presence with God, or however it's expressed in different traditions. And so, but to take everything as an opportunity for learning is not common. But that's really that's the basis for equanimity. So I've learned, and again, a lot of the practices help us to basically not be overly freaked out by what's happening. Because when we get freaked out or go into survival mode, learning is very difficult, right? So how can we turn even difficult experiences into learning experiences? And again, having teachers, mentors, community, teachings, practices, all of these are crucial. So, some of what I have looked at in the context of looking at the larger world and social engagement has been having, there are a lot of things that help, but having a long-term perspective is very helpful. So having a long-term perspective about one's own awakenings, however distant it might seem, to know that that's a trajectory, and that can give some degree of equanimity. And then I think what you were referring to, also I found it inspiring to learn from people who I've met who have these very long-term perspectives about engaging in the process of developing a more sane, sustainable society. So I think of Dr. Ariyaratne from Sri Lanka, who in the context of Sri Lanka said we have to have a 500-year plan because the problems took 500 years to form. He's referring to colonialism and this is particularly in the context of the conflictual relationship between the Tamils and the Sinhalese and so forth. And he said we have to have a 500-year plan because it took 500 years for the problems to form. And so we need to have this long-term view about how we work with them. And so that can be very, very helpful to have have a long-term view. Of course, what does the IPC see, tell us, or what do people say now? Well, we've got 10 years, or I guess that was 2020. We've got 8 years. So how do you have a long-term view with that kind of prognosis, right? So still, and I think it's also related to having a sense that things can move in a mysterious way. I think that's also very important for this equanimity. It's to, to have one's best sense of what's happening, but then to also have a sense that there's a mystery to it. I visited the former Soviet Union 3 months before the Soviet Union ended. Who would have known that it was about to end, right? And or we think of sometimes there are very quick changes can happen. So there's also this mysterious nature to both individual transformation and social transformation, and that's helpful for equanimity. I think it's because one doesn't get overly invested in one's own way of understanding.
Yeah.
And in different traditions, one can you do one's best, you do your best, but then you in a way you give things up to the larger process without thinking that you know everything.
Yeah. So
That's crucial,
do your best and let go of the rest, or something like that.
yeah, or what was the line from T.S. Eliot, one of his poems? How does it go? I think the punchline of that was, you basically do your best and then let things be what they are. I think his punchline was, the rest is not our business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right, so.
Yeah, there's this idea of like the IPCC report possibly bringing up a sense of panic, and then that sense of panic might not be the most useful, and this idea of the zooming out, but also the sense of zooming in at the same time into this moment, into this step, and how they kind of link together is what's coming up for me.
Yeah, it's always about what's the skillful response in this moment. It always comes down to that. So yeah, we can have a long-term perspective, but it's all in the service of being skillful in this moment.
Yeah, I found the talk you did on doing and not doing to be quite kind of alive and interesting. And
it's a very awesome topic, and particularly powerful for people who are doers, which is a large percentage of people in I think in Western cultures. And I found it just, it came out of my own, it came out of, I think, a retreat, or the teaching started last year, although I'd been thinking about it for a long time. It's related to different themes, and there are themes in different traditions. Like I remember my my experience as a young college teacher teaching an ethics class in the evening during American football season, with a large number of football players taking the ethics class as a required class. This is the setup for the torture of a young teacher.
Yeah, or like, as you mentioned before, like a pivotal or strengthening learning point or something.
It was a learning point, and I was having a rough time, and it was painful. And then I remembered this teaching from the Bhagavad Gita about action without attachment to the fruits of one's action. And I said, I'm not sure what's happening here. I will do my best. I will I will not get invested in the results. And who knows what will happen, but I don't know what's happening. And it gave me a lot more ease. And I think it was better teaching. And at the end of the semester, several of the football players came up and said, this was the best class I've had. And
Wow.
yeah, just to give your listeners a clear view, this was an evening class. American football, or football in US and Canada, is somewhat similar. And I was teaching a class maybe at 7 or 7:30 in the evening. And it was about 1/3, if I remember clearly, football players. It was during football season, which meant what had they done right before coming to class? They had their academic classes in the morning, then they had lunch, then they had maybe 3 or 4 hours of football practice. Then they had a really, really big meal. Then they came to my class.
Yeah.
And what were they interested in? Well, probably not the class. Plus it was a required class, so they were taking it just to get through the school. They didn't come out of interest. And so the conditions were not great. So yeah, so having that sense, and then also, the sense of doing and not doing came especially out of about a 1-month retreat that I did last year during the pandemic at home. And the theme that came out of that retreat was bringing non-doing into my meditation and my daily life during that time. And it's a theme that I've worked with for a lot of years. I remember having a teacher probably 20 years ago. I think he could sense that I was an avid meditative doer. I would do these practices or that practices. And he gave me the assignment for a retreat, for a 10-day retreat. This was Christopher Titmuss from England. And who I think has taught a lot in Australia. And he gave me the assignment for this retreat, don't do anything, not even meditation. But don't be distracted and be aware of the absolute. Those were his instructions. I said, whoa, what does that mean? And so, but what was very clear was that it meant not to use any meditative techniques, and yet still to, in a way, be present. And so I was, this was in Devon in England, and I was spending a lot of my time walking in these fields, very, beautiful physical location, with, the hills of Dartmoor, not too far away, where The Hound of the Baskervilles took place, if you ever saw that movie.
I haven't seen that one.
Yeah, it's a Sherlock Holmes story.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, but as I was walking around, and I really got into, I love not doing anything, and I remember having the thought at one point, I'm doing not doing really well. Had that thought, and I got it pretty quickly after that. So going back to last year, there was also something that I've been invited to practice in other meditative approaches, and just to really just not to be doing anything with my mind, letting it just be really zero, not even no instructions whatsoever. And yet, perhaps because of past practice, when there was not doing, there could also be a vast, large awareness present, that when there was a way that I could internally let go of doing, and this large awake awareness would open up.
Yeah, I was recently at a Plum Village retreat, and there was this like gem in the book that I came across around not doing and spending like a day a week not doing.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I was really wondering, like, what is that? What would I do? And what would I do when I'm not doing? And I was kind of what do I do? Do I meditate for the whole day? Do I walk around the garden? Like, what do I do with the day? Like, I couldn't figure that out. And I spoke to a few of the nuns there, and they were saying that, they do different things during the day, and they spend their days kind of really gently, I guess, puttering around would be a way of putting it. But I didn't really, I kind of wasn't really quite sure what that meant for me and how I would try that out. And I'm still yet to try it. I'm really excited about the prospect.
It's a beautiful theme, and I had been aware for a long time of the theme of not doing in the work of Chuang Tzu
Mm.
and Lao Tzu, and particularly Chuang Tzu. And there, it's a translation. The translation, different translations, sometimes translated as non-action. It's a translation of Wu Wei. Could be translated as not doing. And it's not in opposition to doing. In other words, non-action, I think there's a line from one of the passages in Chuang Tzu where it says non-action, translation of Wu Wei, is not inaction. So it's a particular language or particular set of words to talk about a deep level of being. And in the text, it says that non-action comes out of inner emptiness. It comes out of emptiness and the sacred, more or less, and that it's really about doing, which doesn't come out of our usual sense of being a doer, so to speak. And it points to doing, which has at its most fundamental basis not doing. And so it could be meditation, which is a non-meditation, which is a technical term in some Tibetan traditions. So that's really what this is pointing to. In developing it as a talk theme, I also wanted to go through a few stages to get there. So I wanted to, for some people, more doing in meditation or daily life is important, or being an activist, doing is crucial. So there's a place for doing, but this deep sense of doing coming out of not doing is pointing to a very deep kind of action. And this is what I was exploring in the retreat. I think some of this comes out with something that can be more familiar to people in the experience of what is called flow, as described by the Hungarian psychologist Csikszentmihalyi, with the, for English speakers, not easily pronounceable name. It may have sounded like it just came off my lips in a flowing way, but it's been 10 years of practice with his name. So anyway,
well, I think
he has that sense that there is a flow experience, which virtually all of us do experience at times. And the flow experience has a lot of qualities of this deep not doing. It's the flow, there is not self-consciousness, self-image. There can be a large amount of effort, but it feels effortless. Everything may be spontaneously happening without a sense of doing. So I think that can be an entryway if we track those kind of experiences, which I think most of us experience at times. When we're doing something we're really familiar with, maybe very, very good at, and we're just in a very natural state. So we can experience this in, if one's an artist or a musician, just being with something one does well, probably anything one does, a teacher, someone in the helping professions, cooking, could be even in meditating, that there are these experiences, sports, where there's just a sense of flow. And I think that can give a sense of not doing, because part of the sense of not doing in this deep sense is there's not a doer. There's not a sense of self as a doer. and there's not all the thinking, which is usually there and doing, oh, now I should do this, now I should do that. There's a spontaneity and a flow to it.
Yeah.
And in those, for most people, those are very, very beautiful and powerful experiences. So that's an access place, because I think we have to tune in to when those experiences are occurring, because they may just go by and we don't realize they're happening.
Is there a way to this is what I'm interested in, because there's definitely a link there between what we're saying about having a long-term perspective and the presence of this moment, and almost like allowing the action that arises on its own to lead us, rather than doing from that usual habitual place.
Yeah. However one accesses it, and again, it can be, hard to access from a doing perspective. So I think we have to, in my experience, maybe a first step is just to realize when it's already happening on its own, without me trying to make anything happen. And then, tune into those experiences when they're occurring and just enjoy them, and get better at it. And, when I've given talk series on the theme of doing and not doing, the starting point is to have this balance of doing and not doing. So for some of us, it means actually doing more, whether it's in meditation or daily life. And for some of us, it means learning how to relax more into aspects of non-doing. In meditation, it could mean really emphasizing receptivity more and letting go of, now I'm doing this, now I'm doing this, now I'm mindful of this, and just, it could be just relaxing. Oh, I'm having body sensations. Let me relax and just go into a more receptive mode. Let me be with the sunset in a receptive way. So I think that can be, the tuning into the flow experiences, and then opening up to being more receptive with one's experience. I think those are good entryways for developing the sense of non-doing, or moving towards that deeper sense that I described earlier.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There's definitely a sense of this exploration of this not doing that we've just had, but I've got this curiosity coming up around the doing as well. And I know they go hand in hand, but something I've noticed within your book and your talks has been this kind of a interesting way of structuring practice. Of kind of maybe like focusing in on a certain element for a number of days, weeks, or years even. I think you mentioned the 37 wings being like a 2-year focus for you or something, which was like amazing to hear. And I was wondering, how you go about that, and why you've chosen that way, and how that's kind of informed your own practice, and what experience you've had with that kind of approach.
With the approach of focusing on doing at times and then not doing.
But a specific kind of doing with a specific intention. Because what seems to be the case, and definitely share if I'm kind of off track here, but it seems to be there's a reflection on a topic, and then this kind of seems to come up over and over in some exercises in the book, and a couple of what you've shared, talks that you've given. So there's a kind of reflection on a topic, maybe one that you may have found friction with in daily experience. And then there's a going deeper into that intentionally, purposefully, and really, activating that doing element.
I think for myself, my part of my interest in this topic is because I would characterize myself and my kind of upbringing conditioning of being a doer, so to speak. And doing a lot, being able to do a lot, whether it's early, do my homework or have academic success and develop this capacity. And so, I brought that same approach to meditation. And so I wanted to, for me, because doing had seemed to be something I was good at, and I got rewards. I got rewards academically or in other ways. So I brought that whole approach to spiritual life, naturally enough, and said, I'll just, I didn't say this consciously, but I more or less was saying to myself, I'll just be a really great meditative doer. This was kind of in the beginning. And, for me, this translated into meditating a lot. I remember some of my first retreats. These were in the insight meditation tradition at the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, where the early teachers were people like Sharon Salzberg, Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein. And I was doing a lot of those retreats, so to speak. And I wanted to be a good meditator. And I thought I would be a good meditator I didn't know anything other than to just do a lot. That translated into meditating for a longer time than other people, staying up late, getting up early. And, and then and of course, because I think I was in a little bit of a quandary as a doer for whom my past doing had been recognized and rewarded. How do you engage in a meditation retreat, and how can people tell that you're doing a good job? Maybe other than the teachers who you talk to, how can other people tell? Well, the reality is they can't. But I said, well, I guess they can tell if I sit for a long time, and I sit and I have a really great, full lotus, and all the externals basically. And and I remember and of course, reality helped me to explode that set of operating assumptions, because I remember one retreat, I got sick, and I had a cold, and I couldn't sit very long, and I was sniffling the whole time, and I knew that I thought that people would think, oh, he's a bad meditator, which of course probably they weren't paying any attention, but it was actually an early, very difficult, painful experience, because in that retreat, I watched my self-image of being a good meditator fall apart. And it was quite painful, and even, went into some really painful experiences, that can happen at times. But sort of exploding that sense of being a doer. I'm giving that story partly just to give that sense of having a strong identity as a doer, which is the case for a lot of people. And so part of the, I'm going in two directions. I'll say one thing and then come back to your question. So part of what I encourage is to, in a way, look at the identity of being a doer. Look at the self-image. That involves a certain kind of doing. I can, use mindfulness. I can use reflection. I can set my intention to really track when I'm having a strong sense of doing. And one can find this especially maybe when there are times when one has free time or on vacation or a free day. And people, I work with a lot of people, they report getting nervous when they're not doing something, right? And I think that's a very familiar experience. And so that can be the sign of a strong sense of having an identity as a doer. And yet, one of the ways we work with that, in a sense, is by doing something, looking at it, reflecting, inquiring, setting intention to track it, and so forth. So I think my strength as a doer can be, is still a very important aspect of spiritual practice. So it means partly for myself, it meant having a lot of discipline, being able to, go through different teachings, work with them, having a mind that works well with structure, and as well as in teaching, well, a lot of learning in being in the teaching role, really going through different teachings. You were referring to a time when I went through one set of teachings that the Buddha called the 7 sets, which is sometimes called the 37 wings of awakening, which was sort of when he was asked to summarize what's most important, he referred to this list of 7 core teachings, including the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 noble truths, the 4 types of wise effort, the 7 factors of awakening, and so forth. I've named probably 4 of them, I think. And so I went through those in a 2-year process, and sometimes I work with people where I take them through that, similar to what I did, and that's fruitful. So there's a definite place for doing in meditation. So what I was pointing to in our initial discussion was that in the most mature or most developed form, there's no longer a distinction between doing and not doing. And we can start opening up to that, but along the way, we can touch it at different times, but as a stable form of practice, I think it's fairly mature. And for most people, comes fairly late in their practice.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, cool. Thank you for sharing that and opening that up and taking us on a bit of a journey.
Topic. I'm actually in 10 days, I'm going to do a whole day just on that topic, which will be fun.
Definitely, that sounds like a good time.
Yeah.
There was this thing that you mentioned earlier around that painful experience, and I was wondering if we may be able to just touch on the idea of transforming the judgmental mind and touching those spaces that may be quite painful and where our judgments may stem from. And if we could explore that just briefly, that might be really nice, because it kind of feels like it leads on from what you shared.
It's a rich topic. I've chosen the language somewhat carefully of talking about transforming the judgmental mind, because in ordinary English, we use the word judgment in a variety of ways. And sometimes it means like a neutral, non-charged, non-reactive discernment or assessment or evaluation. And I think it's very important to distinguish that from what I'm talking about as when we're judgmental. When we use the word judgmental, that distinction is clear. But it's a very important distinction, because I've often heard, actually, some of my colleagues, fellow teachers, and I've seen this in published books, where people are just down on judgment as such. And I think that can be very confusing to people, because there is a very important place for discernment, judgment, as used in the ordinary English sense of, neutral, non-charged evaluation, as a teacher, when I work with people, it's very important that I have a certain discernment about where they're at. Could call that an evaluation. But the key is whether I'm reactive. So for me, the starting point is a careful definition, and the problem is the reactivity. Is the way that there's a kind of automatic, often automatic, often semi-conscious way that I'm trying to push away something unpleasant or grab hold of something pleasant, which does go back to probably the core teaching of the Buddha, that the core problem, this is there in the teaching on dependent origination, sometimes translated as dependent arising. The core teaching is that the roots of the whole human problem is basically that we grasp after the pleasant and we push away the unpleasant. And we do that somewhat automatically, unconsciously, based on past experience and conditioning. Again, terminology and distinctions are important here. The key is the reactive, automatic, unconscious process of doing that. We can sometimes, in a skillful way, bring about something pleasant, maybe like your cup of tea, or something like that. And so the pleasant isn't the problem, and the unpleasant isn't the problem. It's the reactivity around those two that's the problem. And that is actually a very simple way to talk about the core of 2,600 years of Buddhist tradition. That's it. It's that the core is transform that reactivity. Again, we have to be careful because in English, we sometimes use the word react or reactive without meaning what I'm talking about now. So we sometimes, so I would kind of give a more technical definition and distinguish response from reaction or being reactive. And I think reactive is the best translation of dukkha. The Buddha sometimes said, I teach dukkha and the end of dukkha. And that's right at the center. And I think the meaning of dukkha that is closest to this teaching is that dukkha is reactivity. And so being judgmental is sort of a more elaborate form of that reactivity in relationship to the pleasant or unpleasant. Now we know it probably most easily in relationship to the unpleasant, to something painful.
Would you be able to, sorry to cut you off here.
That's okay.
I'm at some point, it'd be really nice to hear your version of this teaching of the two arrows, because I think that might fit in quite nicely with this.
Yeah, that's right. This teaching about dukkha is, I think, often very confusing for people and presented in I think often in a confusing way, partly because the Buddha himself, I would say, had at least 4 different meanings for dukkha. And the teaching of the two arrows, to me, is the most important one for understanding what the end of dukkha means. Because the most common translation of dukkha is that of suffering. And so we talk about the 4 noble truths, and the second noble truth is the end of suffering. But that's confusing for a few different reasons. One of them is that in English, we don't always distinguish between pain and suffering, and sometimes we do, but often we don't. So, is suffering just having something unpleasant or painful? Well, the primal meaning of dukkha that the Buddha used was that dukkha is the unpleasant. But if we ask, does that meaning of dukkha make sense of the Buddha's attempt to end dukkha? It doesn't, because pain or the unpleasant is always going to be with us. And the Buddha, when he was older, had headaches, presumably unpleasant. He had come to the end of dukkha, but he hadn't come to the end of the unpleasant or the end of painful experiences. And I was just talking earlier today with a friend who's a very, very developed practitioner. And she has had for a good part of her life major health issues, but they don't seem to get in the way of being deeply, deeply awake. They're unpleasant, often in the body, and so forth. So the Buddha gave the sense of something being unpleasant as a core meaning of dukkha, and that's the meaning that's, I think, often translated as suffering. But that doesn't make sense of the end of dukkha, nor do some of the other meanings of dukkha in the text. One meaning is that what is pleasant will at some point become unpleasant, impermanence. But that also doesn't make sense of the end of dukkha, because that's going to always continue. Another understanding of dukkha is that nothing which is conditioned can give lasting satisfaction. And that's true, but it doesn't help us with understanding what the end of dukkha means, because that's always going to be the case. It doesn't end, in other words. So who's the winner of this contest? It's actually the teaching that dukkha is reactivity. And that comes out really, really clearly in the teaching of the two arrows, which is probably my favorite teaching, partly because it gives us a really clear sense. It's a very simple teaching as well. The Buddha was with a group of practitioners, and he asked them a question. He said, everyone at times experiences the unpleasant. What distinguishes a practitioner from a non-practitioner? They didn't answer, so he gave his own answer. And he said, everyone at times experiences the unpleasant. And, we can interpret this to mean sometimes we have unpleasant physical experiences, sometimes unpleasant emotional experiences, or interpersonal experiences, or experiences of the news, or whatever. And that's part of human life, whether one is a deeply awakened person or a total non-practitioner, that's the case. And we could say in a similar way with the pleasant. We all experience the pleasant or the unpleasant. Where the difference is, the Buddha said, is that for the non-practitioner, when the unpleasant experience is there, that person will tend to push it away, thereby creating actually more pain. The Buddha said that everyone experiences it as at times what's unpleasant or painful. He said that's like being shot by an arrow. And he called that the first arrow. And he said that a non-practitioner will tend to shoot a second arrow as if that would help when the first arrow is there. So what does that look like? It means when I have some pain in my body, I might tense in my body. That's a form of the second arrow. And actually it's very important finding that, the well-known innovator, teacher, Jon Kabat-Zinn, who developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, his first job was, when he was, well, let me back up. He was working for the first application of mindfulness in a medical setting was with a group of people with some forms of chronic pain. And what he found was that if you could teach them mindfulness, you could eliminate a lot of the pain, because they found that with some forms of chronic pain, as much as 80% of the pain wasn't the original chronic pain, it was how they tensed around it, how they reacted. And so if you can eliminate the, part of the 80%, it's a major contribution. That was the first medical intervention using mindfulness in the Western world, to the best of my knowledge. And that gets at the point that if we can really eliminate the second arrow, that would be an example of the second arrow, that tensing. Or, I'm in my home and I'm walking in the night and I trip over, my son's shoe, and I blame, the next morning, or I blame my son, and I get really agitated. That's shooting the second arrow. Or I'm judgmental towards myself for what happened yesterday. That's shooting the second arrow. Or I'm in a conflict. Someone says something nasty to me. I right away back say something nasty to that person. That's shooting the second arrow. And we can think of any number of world conflicts or conflicts between countries or between groups, which are examples of shooting the second arrow. So it's a huge thing to learn the teaching is, how can I learn not to shoot the second arrow? And there are a lot of ways to respond to that, but that's the teaching. And I think that it points to, what does it mean to end dukkha? It means to not shoot the second arrow, not to be reactive. I think that's the core of the entire Buddha's teachings, right there. And so I apply that to the judgmental mind. Should I go there now? You want to
Sure.
add
Yes, let's
something?
connect it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that influences how I interpret what I'm calling the judgmental mind. And I mostly in my teaching focus on judgmental mind about something unpleasant, like, oh, I did such a bad job with that talk yesterday. You always mess up, or whatever, however I get on my own case. That would be shooting the second arrow. In this instance, it'd be through the form of being judgmental, blaming, and so forth. I think we can also be reactive and have reactivity with what we might call a positive judgment, because it's the other side of the reactivity in relationship to the unpleasant, is the reactivity in relation to the pleasant, which is grasping on rather than pushing away. Both of them, again, relatively unconsciously, automatically, out of habit. Right. That's.
I think you mentioned like a practical exercise of walking through Bed Bath and Beyond or something, and it brought up something for me around just food, just eating food with us when noticing the greed when that arises.
Yeah. I mean, we can really notice the reactivity just in daily life. How, I think the story you're relating to was, it was from a class that I taught with my colleague Diana Winston, which was a class, we called it greed management. This was about 20 years ago. And we were really into the class. And we had extremely low enrollment. Like, we had 2 teachers and 5 people in the class. And we didn't care. We were really into the topic. And we had it was really interesting to study the nature of greed closely over 5 sessions. And our so-called final exam was walking through a newly opened sort of so-called superstore called Bed Bath and Beyond, and doing silent walking meditation for 30 minutes and watching one's mind. And I was noticing greed for things that prior to entering the store, I didn't know that the products even existed.
So that's a reactionary state, right? This kind of, I mean, not only from positive.
Grasping after the pleasant, which can occur in all sorts of ways. That is, I'm calling that the one of the 2 forms of reactivity. The other form is the negative, the pushing away of the unpleasant. And I'm saying that being judgmental can occur in both ways. We usually think about it, though, more in relation to the unpleasant, but I can be judgmental in a positive way by talking about or thinking about, how cool an outfit I have.
Thank you for your participation in this episode of the Today Dreamer podcast. I'll leave links on our beautiful guest in the show notes section on the website, where you can check out all their wonderful work and offerings. And if you're interested in working one-on-one with me, feel free to head over to todaydreamer.com and get in touch. Also, if you're a part of the Today Dreamer family, which really only means that you've listened to one full episode and you'd like to go deeper to at least one full episode, then and you'd like to participate in some group meditation sessions online that I'm offering for free only to listeners of the show, then please send me an email through the contact form on the website. I'll add you to the list, and I'll give you all the details to that and any other upcoming kind of offerings around helping your development in this space. Thank you so much again. And until next time, be present, feel alive, and be well.